Welcome to the One Priority Podcast, where our goal is starting and strengthening congregations to serve as vital and vibrant missional communities. The One Priority Podcast is sponsored and supported by the Columbia Metro Baptist Association and the almost 100 family churches that support the ministry of the CMBA. This week, we had the opportunity to talk with George Russ and Kevin Cabe from the Metropolitan New York Baptist Association. We were able to hear how God is using a $30,000 gift from the family of churches located in and around the Columbia Metro here in South Carolina to transform lives for His glory through the ministry of brothers and sisters in Christ living in New York City.
We're really glad to have with us today George Russ, who's the Executive Director of the Metropolitan New York Baptist Association, and Kevin Cabe, who works in missions partnerships with them, but has the intelligence to live in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which I think is a really great thing. So George and Kevin, we welcome you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, George.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Well, George Russ, first question I'd like to pose to you. I'm not so sure that people really understand how Southern Baptist work got started in the Metropolitan New York area and how long it's been going on. And so give us a little bit of a foundation. How did things start there, and when did they start?
Well, Southern Baptists have been in New York and New York State since the 1950s. A lot of the presence of Southern Baptists came with job transfers, with people moving north to follow employment to places like Buffalo and Syracuse and New York City. So that's how Southern Baptists kind of arrived in New York, and very soon after that began organizing congregations. From the very, very start, it has always been a multinational kind of presence here. From the earliest stages, we had Spanish and Haitian and other kinds of churches here in the convention. We grew pretty rapidly through the 80s, actually, and kind of peaked a little bit in the late 80s and have been holding our own, I would say, since then. There's been some spurts of growth through the years, but a lot of diversification, too, with church starting amongst different types of people groups that are now here in our area.
Yeah. That's good. Well, George, I remember when I first started traveling to New York with the old Home Mission Board. It was in 1981 when things were really booming there. And I remember experiencing much of that boom during the 1980s. But during this pandemic time, how are the pastors and families of churches, the association, doing in the midst of all that's going on right now?
Well, it's a hard one to pin down, George, because the impact of the pandemic and everything else has been different from neighborhood to neighborhood. That's one of the things about New York that I think people need to remember. The city's a bunch of neighborhoods. It's not a monolithic, culture. So some areas were very, very hard hit, and others just very lightly. So we had one church that had 30 funerals in 1 month. And we had another church that, had no one affected. So the response of the pastors has been kind of along those lines, trying to deal with the reality in their neighborhood. Frankly, some are depressed. I talked to one pastor this week that my voice was the only voice he had heard other than his wife's in a couple of days.
Wow.
And other pastors are really upbeat because for example, one of them has given away 1 million pounds of food in his neighborhood. And when they finally reopen, he doesn't know how many people are going to show up because of the impact they've had. So it goes back and forth between those two.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Great.
Now, George, Russ, when the CMBA's visionary leadership community determined to give a missional tithe to the association there in New York following the sale of one of our properties, none of us knew what kind of impact the pandemic was going to have on New York. However, as is always the case, God is providing for our needs even before we realize that we have a need. So what are some of the ways in which those funds have been used to help strengthen those churches in your area?
Well, I'm going to pass this off to Kevin because it really was Kevin's idea. But the initial request included some help for pastors to come together for brotherhood and fellowship, perhaps in overnight retreats. We had sensed well before the pandemic that this was a need. This was a growing need, isolation and feeling alone. So we kind of prayed through that, and it was Kevin's idea to put together a series of what we called micro meetings. We just concluded them about a week and a half ago. Mm-hmm. So Kevin, why don't you tell Chris and George about how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. When the pandemic started, one of the first things that we started doing initially was weekly prayer calls. And so I think that started the process of getting pastors on the call, and also lay leaders were also joining the call just to for encouragement. I think that's most people wanted to hear what God was doing. They wanted to hear a steady voice, a steady presence, and George was able to offer that. Our staff was able to provide some of that. But I think as months passed and we realized that a typical annual meeting wasn't going to happen. Yeah. And so as we began to process, hey, what can we do? Like, we know that the month of October is pastor appreciation. These guys haven't been with their churches. And so why don't we create a series of micro meetings for the sole purpose, no training, because they've had plenty of training, 7 steps to thrive in the pandemic. Like, they're tired of that, right?
Yeah.
And so we said, hey, let's just get a group of men together across our territory for what we're calling micro meetings. That was really just fellowship in nature. Like, let's come together, let's sit down, socially distance, enjoy a meal, and just hear. Let's talk to one another and hear how we're doing. And so those micro meetings, I think we had 10 or 11 of them just across the city, across the boroughs. We were in Long Island, we were in New Jersey, we were in Connecticut. I think that's the other thing about our association, is that we cover a 75-mile radius from Times Square.
Wow.
So that's a very large territory. So we're in the epitome of urban, and then we're in, off in the rural sections as well. And so again, just out of those micro meetings, we heard the need for brotherhood, fellowship, communication. Let's talk best practices. Let's get together and talk about how this week was terrible. My wife doesn't need to hear that again, but we can sit in a group like this and really have those conversations. And I think it was very eye-opening for us to be able to hear them say that. And I think our association, we've never really acted as a pastor to pastors. We're so diverse. Obviously we want to do that. We want to provide those opportunities. But I think we found the pandemic for George and I is, we have to pivot what we're doing as an association to be able to really encourage during this season. And so I thought they were very successful.
That's good.
Yeah.
Do you all actually have any congregations that you think aren't going to make it out the other end of the pandemic, that they actually are going to end up closing?
I would say we do, but right now we're not really sure how many. One of the things that has happened in the pandemic, George, is that there's been a tremendous economic disruption in the city. I sent some pictures over to our staff the other day. I was at Jamaica train station. If you remember Jamaica, it's a transportation hub for buses, trains, connections to flights at airports, Long Island Railroad. All of those come together in Jamaica. I was there at rush hour, supposedly, on a Thursday afternoon at 5 o'clock, and there was probably 40 people in the whole station. It was empty. It was completely like a ghost town. So there have been churches that had people move away. Some obviously lost members due to the virus. People working at home now. So I don't think we know yet how much disruption that's going to cause in the churches, but we have had several congregations just really, they've pivoted kind of downward into micro church type gatherings because they can't get together in some of their places. So they're not really sure yet how they're going to survive.
Sure, I understand. Yeah. Similar situation in our association also. We've had churches that have struggled before the pandemic, who have really struggled during the pandemic, and are now open to choices and avenues of next step ministries that they weren't open to before. And so in a certain sense, it's been an open door of opportunity.
Right.
By the pandemic. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned concerning the micro meetings was that this is kind of brought a cohesiveness for the pastoral element. These pastors, even from diverse backgrounds with diverse congregations, are starting to come together. Is this kind of what led your association to start offering, I think, what you guys are calling synergy calls? What's going on with that? What is what's taking place through that particular opportunity that you guys are offering?
Yeah, well, Synergy is the name we give to our training opportunities that we provide at our building, and we were planning to diversify that to other regions before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Synergy is we put it together, but we usually have local people who come and share what they're doing in training disciples, praying, preaching in an urban context, social ministry, rest and relaxation, mental health for pastors, a variety of subjects that I think really appeal to pretty much everybody. So when the pandemic came, we pivoted that to being completely online. Mm-hmm. And we changed some of our subjects to be more appropriate for the pandemic. So that's what Synergy has been. It's going to continue to be online for the rest of this year. We were toying with the idea of opening it up again, but with some spikes in some neighborhoods, we said this is probably just the best just to keep it online for the rest of the year. And we're looking in the future to do what are some core competencies that everybody needs to have to minister effectively in a place like Metro New York. Right. And we're talking about those kinds of subjects for the near future. Mm-hmm. Kevin, you're on all of those. What would you add about Synergy?
Yeah, no, I think Synergy, at least for the last few months, again, those are fellowship in nature too, but the training component has been really good, especially during the pandemic, because a lot of our churches were not online. They had zero online presence, no website, no Facebook. And so through those trainings, we were able to help pivot and get them online so they can continue to communicate with their congregations.
And we would typically have, George, probably 35. We've had as high as 50, which during the week on a Tuesday, to come to Manhattan for a meeting like that, I think is pretty significant. Yeah. Online, we haven't had quite that number, but we have had a very diverse audience join us. So we're really pleased about that.
Yeah.
Well, I think obviously one of the things that we're interested in trying to engender interest in our own association is that there might be congregations and individuals that would want to be of more significant support and more personalized support to New York as and when and where and how appropriate. And so, Kevin, I'd be interested in hearing you talk about some of the partnership opportunities that are available in the New York area. And also the issue of, since you're in Myrtle Beach, the possibility of your coming over and meeting with some of our churches about that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the places I like to start with churches is to ask the question, hey, what is God doing in your church now? And specifically in the area of missions, how are you engaging your community? Are you engaging, the international scene? Are there any other countries that you're involved in? And really just kind of asking those questions to get a base level of what they're thinking. In New York, you can come to New York City and have an international experience. You can come to New York and you can be involved in church planting. You can be involved in college ministry. There's over 1 million college students that are in New York City. Our established churches need assistance. They need help with vacation Bible schools, marriage conferences, retreats, and things like that. So there's plenty of opportunities. And so I like to start with those questions first, and then move to a vision trip. There's nothing like walking the streets of New York and seeing the faces, seeing the people, and letting God really grip your heart. As George said, New York is made up of communities. There's over 400 communities in New York City. And of course, we don't have time to go over all of them, but there's so many different pockets. We lead a tour that we call See the World on the 7 train. And that's a tour that starts at our building. We go to Times Square, and then we're going to take the 7 train out to Flushing. But along the way, we pass one of 3 Chinatowns in Flushing, We touched Jackson Heights, which is a hub for Southeast Asians. We're going to see Corona, Queens, which is a hot spot for Latin America, people from those countries. And so again, that's just one train ride. We have 900 miles of train tracks there in New York City. So, but again, it's just starting a dialogue of what God is doing there and how that can translate into New York City. So I would be a starting point for that. You can contact me. You can visit our website, mnyba.org, and get some information there about partnerships as well. So I think it's exploring, letting God really direct where we're going, and then looking at opportunities of how their church can come alongside of the local church to support and prop them up through prayer, through giving, through sending people, through sending interns. Maybe there's a 18 to 25-year-old that's sitting in their church saying, what am I doing with my life? We'll send them to New York. Or maybe there's someone who's getting their education, wrapping up college. They want to be a teacher. Well, go spend 2 years in New York City and be a teacher, and work and serve alongside of a local church. So,
Kevin, one other thing about that, and that is that one of the things that we're just now posting about and are going to be using with some of our congregations here in the association, but we also want to emphasize the fact that this is local in terms of what's going on, local and global, is that we're starting an emphasis called missional mobs. Now, this goes back to the old flash mobs understanding, where you'd have this performance art and people would gather and that kind of thing. But I don't know if how many people know that the Roman Catholic Church actually developed a missional strategy around that, and they called it mass mobs, thinking about the mass service, where people would go when there was a missional opportunity in another parish and take a group, and either it was a one-time event or it was an ongoing 6-month to year-long kind of process. And so don't know where that's going to head, but we could hope that maybe the concept of missional mobs in terms of being missional, in terms of a breakthrough service that might happen, and that's sort of the MOBS in terms of what's happening there. But hey, Chris, another thing, you've expressed a real interest in knowing more about internationals in a place like New York as compared to a place like Columbia, and what approaches are, that kind of thing.
Right. And the reason why George and I had talked about that is, I know that New York is a major hub for international ministry, as you guys have said, and also through my own research. But what's interesting to me is that Columbia has become a hub for international ministry. Talking to Robbie McAllister, one of our ministry mobilizers here with the CMBA, he's done a lot of work with international ministry, and I think we have like 17 different nationalities that are organized into possible congregations, as well as anywhere from about 75 different nationalities that exist in the Columbia metro area. And so from that, what's some things that you guys have learned that maybe we can also learn and implement in our context as we seek to do international ministry?
Well, that's a really great question, Chris. The truth is about New York is that right now it's almost at an all-time high, the number of foreign-born in the 5 boroughs. Mm-hmm. It's approaching 40%.
Wow.
So if you add to that their children, or 1.5 generation or 2.0, whatever nomenclature that you may use, well over 50% of New Yorkers do not speak English around the dinner table.
Wow.
So that's a pretty amazing reality.
Yeah.
So we've done a few things that I think are really helpful. One, Kevin has been a part of, and I've been a part of, what we call Coats for the City. It's been a December event every year where we started in Queens with one location, 800 coats in a South Asian context. We learned real quickly that newly arrived people from other warmer climates are usually ill-prepared to meet the winter climate here.
Yeah.
So we set up a coat giveaway with prayer stations and chai, and in some cases even concerts or outdoor singing. And that's grown from one location to, I think it was, how many, Kevin? 17, 18?
18.
A year ago. We're not having it this year, where we had 8,000 jackets distributed in 18 locations in established churches, in church plants, and volunteers came for that one day. We worshiped the day before, we gave out coats and witnessed the next day, and then went to church the following day with the church that we helped. So we host events like that help people kind of put their toe in the water when it comes to international ministry. Right. And that's been a real positive thing for us. And then in Christmas, we have something called International Christmas. Kevin, you organize that, so maybe you can go over what that does for us.
Yeah, so International Christmas in New York is really designed to serve our international churches, and so we've recruited churches and BCMs across the country to come and to participate. First of all, it's Christmas in New York, but essentially they're working alongside of Chinese churches. I know in one instance with a Chinese church, they helped do a backpack drive and fill supplies and would distribute those. So they're serving along the Chinese churches in Chinatown and in Brooklyn. They're serving among the South Asians in Jackson Heights, more outreach events there as well. So, but I think, George, to go back to the Coats for the City for a second, I think what was pretty important in our context was we took a pastor there and really just walked the streets of his neighborhood and said, where are your people? Where do they live? What do they need? Yeah. How can we help? How can we serve? And how can we come along? And so what started as just a small idea morphed into a citywide event for us. And then the second thing I would say is, again, because New York is so diverse, we really support those groups. You know, they've kind of naturally formed their own groups. And so we'll speak into those groups, resource those groups as well. And I think that's been really important, identifying, supporting, and resourcing. So
good. Yeah. Well, guys, this has been great. I would ask, sort of in a kind of a recap, if you were to mention either George or Kevin, either one, 2 or 3 really high priority things that you wish that congregations maybe from the Columbia Metropolitan Baptist Association might be a part of with New York in the near future. What's coming at you right now as this pandemic hopefully wanes over the next several months, but we'll see.
Kevin, I'll let you do that first.
Yeah. You know, as much as I would love to say send teams, and I think that's going to come, I think please pray. I don't want to underscore the importance of prayer right now. The stress, the depression, the weight and the burden that your brothers and sisters up north are carrying right now is really heavy. So I would advocate, set aside a Sunday morning, set aside a Wednesday night, just set aside some time to pray. And George, and I'll take this time to throw this in. You referenced that I live in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I would love to come and speak to churches in your association and just to share. But prayer would be the first thing that I would recommend. George.
Yeah. Well, I certainly would say that as well. I do think that there is going to be some collection of congregations coming together to, I don't know if they're going to form a legal entity or not, but they definitely want to augment what they've been doing in ESL, immigration, food distribution, medical care, things like that. And we have churches that have different skills in those areas or experiences in those areas, and we're trying to network them. We don't really quite know how to do that. So pray for us for sure. But if you have any kind of experience in forming nonprofits to address issues like that, that would be something we could use some expertise on. George, we are looking at our building as well. I mean, we have a beautiful building on 72nd Street. It is extremely expensive to run. We own it, but it's still expensive to run. Wow. So we are praying through how do we maximize that building for missions. And We don't know what the answer to that question is right now. We have a team looking into everything, but man, if you had any counsel for us, that would be a real plus for us as well.
Good. Well, great.
Well, George and Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to spend some time talking to us about the ministry taking place up there.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining with us, and please be sure to check out the show notes for more detailed information about today's show. Also, if you found this podcast helpful for you and your ministry, share it with others so we can get the word out about what God is doing. Until next time, from all of us, we thank you for listening and urge you to share this podcast with everyone you know. It's the good news about the good news in the Columbia Metro Baptist Association.